Welcome to another episode where we look at history and culture through the lens of beer.
Always a good time.
Today we're talking about something that might surprise you.
So what is it?
Sour beers.
Oh,
Those tart and tangy brews, they've been around for centuries.
right.
But they're notoriously tricky to make.
Yeah.
It takes a long time.
Mm,
And with our changing climate, it's becoming even more challenging to get them to just right.
I can imagine.
But some innovative brewers in Norway are experimenting with a surprising ingredient
Oh.
to make the process faster and more reliable.
Interesting. What could that be?
And that ingredient is peas.
That's right. And before you picture a paint glass full of mushy peas, let me assure you, it's not like that at all.
Okay, I have to admit, peas and beer sounds a bit odd,
I can see that.
but I trust you know what you're talking about.
Well, I've been doing my research.
You've been digging into some pretty fascinating research, haven't you?
I have. It's a paper published just last month in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry.
Okay.
And it's called pea-derived rafos family oligosaccharides as a novel ingredient to accelerate sour beer production.
Catchy.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically explains how these brewers are using a specific type of sugar found in peas
Okay.
called rafos family oligosaccharides.
Wow.
RFOs for short, to make amazing sour beers in a fraction of the time.
So RFOs are the key here.
They are.
But why are these sugars so special for brewing?
Well, for one, traditional sour beers rely on wild fermentation,
Right.
which means brewers let whatever microbes are naturally present in the air do their thing.
Oh, interesting.
It's kind of like sourdough bread.
Okay.
This process gives the beers their unique, funky, and tart flavors.
Right.
But it's also what makes them so difficult to brew consistently,
Hmm.
especially with climate change, making it harder to maintain those cool temperatures.
Yeah.
Those wild yeast and bacteria need to thrive.
So you're saying that by using these RFOs from peas brewers can have more control over the process
That's right.
and make consistently delicious sour beers.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting.
Oh,
Those RFOs can't be digested by the typical brewer's yeast used in most beers.
really?
But certain bacteria, the kind that gives sour beers their signature tang, absolutely love them.
So it's like giving those souring bacteria their own special feast,
Yes.
and they reward us with a delicious tangy brew.
Precisely. The researchers screened 14 different types of lactic acid bacteria.
Wow.
Those are the ones responsible for the sourness,
Right?
to see how well they grew on these pea-derived sugars.
Okay.
And not only did these bacteria thrive, but they also produced acid faster than in traditional brews,
Oh, cool.
meaning the beer sours up quicker.
So less waiting around for a great sour beer. I like where this is going. But what about the taste?
Yeah,
I imagine some people might be hesitant to try a beer brewed with peas.
I understand.
Does it taste, well, beany?
That's a good question. And you're right, nobody wants a beer that tastes like split pea soup. But surprisingly, a sensory panel, a group of trained tasters,
Mm-hmm.
actually rated the RFO beers as having a pleasant acidic taste,
Oh, okay.
with even less beany flavor compared to a commercial Belgian sour beer they used as a reference.
Less beany, more sour, faster brewing. Okay, I'm officially intrigued.
It's pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah.
And there's another cool aspect to this whole thing. Remember how I mentioned that RFOs are extracted from peas?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out they're a byproduct of making pea protein concentrate,
Huh.
which is becoming increasingly popular as a plant-based protein source.
So we're essentially using something that might have otherwise gone to waste.
Exactly, making this a win-win for brewers and the environment.
I like that. So these brewers are not only creating a faster and potentially more reliable way to make sour beers, but they're also finding a way to use a food byproduct that might otherwise be discarded. Now that's what I call a delicious and sustainable brew. So they tested these bacteria and figured out which ones love those pea sugars. What happened next?
Well, then they went from the lab to the brewery,
Mhm.
brewing 2 different batches of sour beers using these RFO-loving bacteria.
So they put their research to the test. And I bet you're going to tell me the results were pretty impressive.
You bet.
Okay.
But before we get into the results, I want to talk a bit about the actual process of brewing with these RFOs.
Oh, okay.
It's fascinating stuff.
Let's hear it. I'm all ears.
All right, so these brewer in Norway, they started by creating a typical beer base called wort using barley malt, wheat malt, and rice hulls. Pretty standard stuff.
Sounds familiar so far.
Then they divided this wort into 2 batches.
Okay.
To one, they added the special pea-derived RFO extract. The other batch was their control batch brewed without the pea sugars.
Okay, so one batch was pea-powered and the other was business as usual, smart way to compare.
Exactly. Then they added a mix of yeast and those special lactic acid bacteria, the ones we know, love to munch on RFOs, to both batches, and they let the fermentation begin.
It's amazing to think about all those tiny microbes working away, transforming those sugars into something delicious. How long did this fermentation process take?
They let it ferment for 19 days now. That might seem like a long time, but for a traditional sour beer, it's actually quite short. Some of those classic sour beers can ferment for well over a year.
Wow, 19 days versus a year, that's a pretty significant difference. So even though they're using these newfangled ingredients, they're still getting a much quicker turnaround time. I imagine that's a big plus for brewers.
Absolutely. It could make sour beers more accessible to smaller brewers who don't have the time or resources for those longer traditional fermentation method. But here's the truly exciting part. After those 19 days, they analyzed the beers, and all the sour beers, both the RFO ones and the control batch, reached the perfect level of tartness.
So they all had that classic sour beer pucker.
They did, but the RFO beers had even more of that lip-smacking tartness than the control beers, and even more than a commercial Belgian sour beer they used for comparison.
Wow, so those pea sugars really kicked those bacteria into overdrive, more sourness, faster brewing, what's not to love. But you mentioned earlier that they also did some taste testing. What did those folks think?
Well, not only did the RFO beers deliver on that sourness, but the sensory panel actually found that they had more pronounced fruity flavors compared to the beers brewed without the RFOs.
Fruity, that's not what I would have expected.
Right, you'd think the added sugars might just amp up the sweetness, but it seems they actually helped unlock those brighter, fruitier notes. And I remember how we talked about that beanie flavor being a potential concern.
Yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind when you said peas and beer.
Well, the tasters rated the RFO beers as having less beanie flavor than that commercial sour beer they used for comparison.
So the pea-derived sugars actually made the beer less beany and credible. It seems like they might have stumbled onto something pretty special here.
They might just have, and it's not just about the flavor either. Remember, these RFOs are a byproduct of making pea protein concentrate, which means brewers are essentially using something that might have otherwise gone to waste.
It's like they're taking something that was destined for the trash and turning it into liquid gold, or in this case, liquid sour.
Exactly, and using those byproducts contributes to a more sustainable food system, less waste, more delicious beer. It's a win-win.
I love that this research is showing that thinking outside the box, or in this case, outside the pint glass, can lead to some really innovative and delicious results.
Absolutely, and it really highlights how much we can learn from the natural world. Those tiny bacteria are doing all the heavy lifting, transforming those pea sugars into those amazing flavors we enjoy in sour beers.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected ingredients can lead to the most delightful discoveries. So what exactly are those RFOs and how do they make such a difference?
That's a great question. Let's take a closer look at those remarkable sugars. So we've been talking about these RFOs, raffinose family, oligosaccharides, and how they're shaking up the world of sour beer brewing. But what exactly are these sugars and why are they such a big deal?
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my mind around that part.
Well, they're complex sugars, more complicated than the simple sugars like glucose that we usually think of. They're made up of multiple sugar molecules linked together, and they're found in a variety of plants like peas, beans, and lentils.
Right, those are all foods that are getting a lot of attention these days, especially with people looking for plant-based protein sources.
Exactly, but here's the thing. Those RFOs aren't exactly easy for us to digest. They're the reason beans have that, shall we say, musical reputation.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Our bodies lack the enzymes to break down these complex sugars, so they end up being fermented by bacteria in our gut, which, as we all know, can lead to some discomfort. But in the context of brewing, that's actually a good thing.
Because we want those bacteria to be active, we want them to ferment those sugars and produce that lactic acid that gives sour beers their signature tang, right?
You got it. And because those RFOs can't be broken down by the typical brewer's yeast, they're like a dedicated food source for those lactic acid bacteria. You get to have an all-you-can-eat buffet, and we get a delicious, tangy beer.
It's like a symbiotic relationship between brewers and bacteria, all thanks to these pea-derived sugars.
I like that way of putting it. And remember, those RFOs are already being extracted from peas during the process of making pea protein concentrate, so brewers are essentially using a byproduct that might have otherwise gone to waste.
It's like a double-win delicious beer and a more sustainable brewing process. It makes you wonder what other hidden gems are out there in the world of food science, just waiting to be discovered.
I think that's what makes this research so exciting. It's a great example of how we can use science and innovation to not only create tastier beers, but also make the brewing process more environmentally friendly.
Absolutely, and I think it's a reminder that there's always more to learn and explore, even in something as familiar as beer. Who would have thought that peas could hold the key to unlocking a whole new world of sour beer deliciousness?
Right, and that's what we try to do here on the show. Take a closer look at the things we think we know and uncover those hidden stories and unexpected connections.
So if you're enjoying these deep dives into the world of food history and science, don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic and some more surprising ingredients.
Cheers to that.
Cheers.